Hello, and thank you for joining us. My name is Manny Castro. I'm the Technical Services Specialist at Siegel Scientific, authors of the Bartender software. In today's webinar, we will be building a web integration. We will be using a third-party application to send a web request to Bartender's integration platform. These requests will trigger the integration to print your labels out. Now, before we begin discussing the specific integration we will be building today, let's quickly cover 3 of the main components that make up your integration. Not just this one, any integration. At this point, your labels have been designed and you're ready to integrate with your system or other piece of software. The 3 things to take into account is the trigger, data, and actions that will be executed. The trigger is going to be what initially triggers the integration to occur. It is essentially what we are waiting for to execute whatever actions the integration has been programmed to do. Some samples of this are file, database, or a web integration. The data is going to be the format or the structure of the data coming in over the trigger or integration method. There are several and really almost endless options on the data and the data structure that can be passed. The important thing, of course, is to make sure that the data structure is consistent. For example, if we decide to build an integration using the print command script, we'll want to make sure that we comply with that syntax moving forward for that integration. Lastly is the action. The action is what you would like or need executed or done once the trigger has occurred and the data passed. With Bartender, of course, one of those actions almost always ends up being to actually print a label. However, pending the data coming in, you might want to adjust your actions accordingly. For print command script, we'll want to make sure that we select the action that we want to execute the print command script, or we might want to do a search and replace or parse or modify our data before we actually print the label out. So we'll see how all this comes together in the live demonstration portion of today's session, but it is really important just to understand those 3 main components of designing an integration. Also incredibly important is to understand that a lot of these are interchangeable. So for example, you can have a web integration that passes print command script data, and the actions are to print the label and then write the data to a file. And that can be interchanged with really any kind of data or any kind of actions. Today specifically, we'll be building an integration where the trigger is a web request, the data is JSON data and web request data, and the actions are to just print a document. So first, let's begin on the question, what is a web request? An HTTP web request is a request response protocol which allows your computer to send a request to another device. This is a request sent from one HTTP capable device or machine to another. Usually this is sent from a client to server and a response back to the requester. The easy way to digest this is you send a request to a server simply by typing in a URL in a browser and hitting enter. That server responds with data that your browser can process and display as a web page. At a high level, that is what a web request is. You are passing or requesting data and then receiving a response or a confirmation of that receipt. There are also various methods or types of requests that exist. The type of request that is made usually indicates what the request will do and or how the data will be passed by the request. One of the major advantages of using a web integration is that these web requests and HTTP as a protocol in general is bidirectional by nature. So when you send a request, you get a confirmation or response from the server that your request has been received. If we go back to discuss this in regards to Bartender now, one of the big questions that comes to mind is, why would we want to use a web integration? If we talk historically, one of the commonly used integration methods with Bartender has been using a file integration. A file is dropped and it's picked up by Bartender's integration platform. We rename or delete the file, and then what? Some of the information the application that created that trigger that it might be interested in is, was the trigger received? Are there any error messages? Did the label itself print? What data actually printed on the label? With a web request, we have a built-in bidirectional communication that allows us to integrate the 2 systems more closely. Let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about the specific integration we'll be building today. In general, we now know what an integration is. So specific to a web integration, Bartender's integration platform waits for a web request to be sent to it, to its URL. Bartender receives the web request, and your label prints. Today, we will be building two types of web integration. We will be using the GET and POST methods. Let's go ahead and talk about those briefly. The first method will be POST. A POST web request data is sent in the message body of the request and not in the URL. So if we want our data to be a little bit more secure or passing a large amount of data, we'd pick this method. And then keep in mind, whenever I mention data here or wherever you see data on your screen, we're talking in reference to the actual data that we'll be passing, not always necessarily the URL itself. The second is the GET method. A GET web request data is sent in the URL itself after the server URL. We'll be passing the data in what's called query parameters. The data in each of the parameters we pass will be automatically placed in variables by the integration platform. And while using GET-REQUEST usually indicates a request for data, you can use this method as a simple way to request a label to print. So we'll get a visual using a third-party application of both of these methods, and we'll get a better understanding of them during the live demonstration. Also remember that both of today's methods can pick the label, populate it, and select the printer that we want to send the job to. Also, of course, because this is a web request, they'll both receive a response assuring the sender that its request has been received. So let's go ahead and start building our POST web integration. We'll begin in Bartender itself. We want to make sure that we understand what we want our label to look like for the type of integration that we're building today. So, of course, our label has already been designed, and all we're concerned about at this point is giving our data sources a name, turning them into what we call named data sources. So if we look on the left, we see that we already have one that exists. So we have the serial number on the bottom right. Let's go ahead and also name the tracking number here so we can populate that one via our integration as well. And those are going to be the two data sources that we concern ourselves with today. So I'm going to double click on the tracking number. I'm going to click on the data source that I want to name on the left. And then on the right, I'm going to go ahead and click on this yellow icon and give this a name. So we'll go ahead and just name it tracking number, keep it simple, and we'll hit OK. We'll hit close. And at this point, we have two named data sources that we can call from the integration itself. So let's go ahead and hit save. And let's minimize Bartender itself. And then before we open Integration Builder itself, I do want to open this client that we're going to use to actually send the request to Bartender, just so we can get a little bit of an understanding of what we're actually sending and what we're building the integration around. So the first one we have is the POST web integration that we discussed. And here we have JSON data, and we have some name value pairs. So these are going to be the 4 name value pairs that we're going to use throughout our integration. So these names right here will be automatically inserted into what we call variables by the integration platform. And these are going to be the values for our little test integration that we're building. So now that we have a visual on the variables, let's go ahead and open Integration Builder itself. And this is going to be the tool that you use to build any integration, really. So we'll go ahead and we'll hit Create New Integration. We're going to click on Web Service, and we're going to hit OK. Right away, we'll see all our options on the left and their properties on the right. We'll want to begin at the top. Let's go ahead and let's give this integration a name that we can actually understand what it's doing, not just web service integration. So we'll go ahead and we'll just name this one Post. Then we'll go down to Service. And we'll notice here that the service name is actually a variable. So anything in the integration platform inside of percents is considered a variable, and its integration name. So the name that we've just given this integration is going to be part of the URL that bartender is going to be listening on. So here we see that it's going to be the host name, integration, and web service integration post /execute. So now that's important because whatever sender or whatever application is going to be sending us a request, this is what we're going to supply them with or program it with. The next important thing is going to be the port. So if we ever want it to run on a port other than the traditional port 80, this is where we would make that change. The next option down is because we're using JSON name value pairs, we want to make sure that the integration platform itself is aware that we're going to send it that kind of data. So for this one, we'll go ahead and we'll set it to JSON variables. And for the time being, you do have to send only name value pairs. And then we can move down to response. So another very important dialog or properties box as well to visit, because once again, if we recall, one of the huge advantages of actually using this type of integration method is that we're going to be getting a response. And not just a response back that the request has been received, but we can also get other data and other variables and information about the print job and request that we just sent through. So going from top to bottom, the first thing that we see is just the uncheck or check the box to actually send a response to the client. The next box we see is going to be if we want to wait for actions to complete before sending the response to the client. So now this is going to be important when we have a situation where perhaps the print job is doing much more than just printing a label, or perhaps it's a really complex label or a complex query that it's performing, and we don't want it to wait until that whole sequence of actions has executed, but instead we want it to send, it being the integration platform, send a response back to the client right away. So we'll go ahead and we'll leave it on wait for today. And the next thing is going to be the content type. By default, we see that it's set to XML, but this is where you would set, for example, if you want to send back JSON or SOAP plus XML or just plain text. Let's go ahead and leave it on plain text for now. And then we see the source. So this is going to be the source of what's actually going to be sent back. We have embedded template, variable, an external file, or action summary. If we click on embedded template, we'll notice that it allows us to build, almost if you will, a custom response. So if we send this variable and the job is successful, we'll actually get the response that the print job was successful. Now, at this point, as of now, the integration platform does respond with the quote-unquote % response % if the integration fails. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to do an action summary. And that's just going to allow us to give us a summary of all the actions that have been executed, as well as a status of the print job itself. For this one, since we're sending in JSON data, let's go ahead and just leave it on that as well. And then we can move on to the next important thing, which would be the print document. Like any action with any integration, you can rename this action. You can also set it to run under a specific condition or build an expression under which this action should execute. Let's go ahead and let's browse for our folder or for our label. We're going to go to the directory where I saved that bartender document. Here's my shipping label. We're going to hit open. And then we're going to hit import document settings. We do want to continue with this. And this is going to bring in all those named data sources and printers that we used. So now if we scroll down, we see that all that information has been brought in for us. Here we see our two named data sources that we just created. But we do want to have some of this data be dynamic. So we want the printer to be ever-changing. We want the document to be ever-changing based on whatever's coming in via our integration, right? We don't want this to be static. So we'll go ahead, and what we'll do is we'll erase that static data. And instead, what I'm going to use, if we look down here, so bartender label, that's going to be my variable. And remember, variables are always placed inside 2%. And I'm going to go ahead and just call this bartender label. And what's going to happen is, because we set the input data to JSON variables in anticipation of the name value pairs, the integration platform is going to automatically take this value, being the printer name, and put it inside this variable. The next thing we'll do is the printer name. Again, putting 2%. And then we're going to scroll down, and we're going to assign the variables to those data sources on our label. So this is how we tie the data coming in to all the objects, like barcodes and text objects on the label itself. So for the serial number, again, we're just going to erase this. And type in the serial number, putting them inside of the percents. Same thing for the tracking number. And then if we had any other variables to use, we can plug them in anywhere that we see the little blue X. We can also do database overrides, and we can specify values for query prompts. So if our bartender label was connected to a label of some sort, this is where we could leverage the data coming in to select a record to print. The next thing we'll do is we'll hit test. We'll start the integration, make sure that we don't get any error messages right off the bat. And then we're going to bring up our client over here, which is going to send this data to this URL. And if you'll notice, so that's my PC name right there, the integration, and then what we just named our integration as well. On the right, we should see the response that we get after we send this to the integration platform. So if we sent the label to print, we see on the right that bartender has successfully sent the print job to the spooler, so it has successfully printed. Then if we hit send again, we see the occurrences go up on the left, event occurrences we have 2, and then we see that the next document in line has printed right away as well. So at this point, we have successfully built our post-web integration. So the next thing that we'll do, because we are going to be building 2 of them, is going to be our get web integration, which is actually going to be using the same label, and we're going to be going back into bartender itself, and we're just going to be using a little bit different request method to get the same goal across. So just to verify, we're still using the same label with the same name data sources. And then to get a visual on our request, if we look at our client, this is going to be what our request look like. It's going to be simply the URL that we are going to build. And then at the end of the URL, we're going to declare all these query parameters, which are going to be the printer name, the bartender label, the tracking number, and the serial number. So now in theory, if we build this correctly, we can take this URL right here and copy and paste that into a browser, and it'll do the same thing as if I'm sending it from this client here, which is actually print a document out with those values. So let's go ahead and let's go back to our integration builder. Now that we got a visual on the request that we're going to send it and build the integration around, I'm going to go ahead and stop the one that we already started here and tested. And we are able to build more than one integration per integration file. So let's click on the top left here, click on integration. We'll say web service. And here we have our next integration automatically added for us. We're going to start again at the top where we see the integration name itself and its properties on the right. And let's just go ahead and name this get. And that should be enough to distinguish between the two. Again, we're going to go to service. We're going to verify that we're familiar with that URL path. Very important that we send the request to this URL. And again, the port itself. For the authentication methods, this is where we would set the authentication methods that is going to be running the integration under. And then we'll go ahead and we'll set the response. We'll want to check or uncheck if we want to send a response to the client itself. Again, do we want to wait for all the actions to execute, or do we want to send a response back to the client right away? We can set the content type. Let's leave it on XML so we can get a visual on a different type of response. And once again, we have the same options for the source type. Let's go ahead and do action summary again. Then we're going to go to print document. And you're going to notice that we follow very familiar steps. It's just the data in the request is in another location. So let's go ahead and import the document that we're going to be using. Let's import the document settings. And that helps as well when you have a lot of named data sources to make sure that you don't make any typos or mistakes on calling the named data sources on the label itself. And then we're just going to use these same variables here. So bartender label, printer name, tracking number, and serial number. And we're going to put them inside variables because the integration platform is going to grab those parameters from the URL itself and put the value of those parameters into the variables so that they can be plugged in over here. We have the bartender label. We have the printer name. We'll scroll down. Once again, if we had a database override to do, or we had a query prompt that we wanted to specify, we would do the same exact thing as if it was a named data source here. Check the box and populate it with the variables that we need. I'll go ahead and I'll populate the variables for the two named data sources that we have on our label. We'll scroll back up. We'll make sure that everything looks correct. We'll go to test on the bottom left. So up here we see all the details of our integration that we're testing, the actions in the middle, and then output. So that's going to be really important to pay attention to. Obviously, that's where we're going to see all our error messages and all that. So let's go ahead and let's start the integration, and let's see if we get any kind of error message. And that looks fine. And then let's open up our client and send an actual GET web request to the integration platform. So this is pretty much what the URL looks like, and that's what we're sending over. We'll go ahead and we'll hit send. We'll see that the label executes in the background. We see that bartender has successfully sent the print job to the spooler. That's a successful print, that's what we want. And we see the same thing in the response over here. So if we send another label, we see right away we get another response. And then every label after that will just keep on doing the same thing, where it automatically just keeps on printing, keeps on sending a response, and it keeps on going. So let's go ahead, and now that we're happy with this integration because we've seen that it's working, what we're going to do is we're going to save the integration. So I'm going to click on save. I'm going to give the integration a name. Let's just call it web. integration. Okay, then I'm going to do what's called deploy the integration. So this is actually going to be where I deploy the integration. Now, what that means, or the difference between what we've been doing and an actual live or deployed integration, is if I close Integration Builder, even though we were just running and it was just working, you also close the integration, because remember, all you're doing at that point is testing it. Deploying the integration sends it to the administration console, which is another companion application, and that's where all your live or deployed integrations are going to live. So we'll go ahead and we'll give it a name. We could give it a description if we needed. We can send it to this server, which is my PC, or another PC or server, and then we can set a schedule upon when we want the integration to be deployed. Let's go ahead and hit OK. What that's going to do is it's going to, once again, send it to the administration console. That should open up for us momentarily. And there we'll see all the integrations that we have running. So now remember that we have 2 integrations that are running under this one integration file. You can run multiple integrations with each containing multiple integration files within the administration console. So they would just show up and populate below each other. So at this point, we can go ahead and we can stop the test over here, and we can just minimize the integration builder. And actually, we can even just close it out since we do have it saved. And here we see our 2 integrations. We can drill into each one independent of each other, and we'll get a familiar screen here. This should look like the test section of Integration Builder. So here we see that it's running. We see the status of it. It's waiting for events. We see all the actions. And then we see the output, which is all the error warnings or event messages. So let's go back out and let's see if we can send another print job to it. So that event has went through successfully. We printed out the label. We see that we have 2 occurrences there. Both of them were successful. Let's try our other integration, which is the post integration. We can hit send. We get a response right away that label has now printed. Send another one to be sure. And then we see the event occurrence here. We have successfully printed all 4 labels, 2 to each integration, and received successful responses each time we ran that integration. Okay, so at that point, everything has been deployed and successfully printing a deployed integration, and we're ready for the questions.
Is the tray selection something that can be specified in the web integration call?
Yeah, that's a good question. So anything, and I'm assuming that that's the tray selection to the printer itself. So anything that you saw as one of the dialogues in, throughout the integration itself, you can use a variable to populate it. So if we go into our integration builder, and let's see if we have the option here. Okay, so here we have the paper tray option. So now you'll want to make sure that you get the right verbiage, or do a search and replace, whatever it may be, to make sure that your integration passes something that's valid for your printer. But this is the box that you will check. And then let's say you are passing a variable. This will error out, obviously, if I run it. But we can say printer tray. And then this same integration can send different jobs to different printers from different trays.
Can data be passed in a SOAP message?
Yes, it can. So for that, the only thing that you'll want to make sure that you check is under input data. You'll just want to make sure that you check the box that data is contained in a SOAP message.
Sending a response to a different API. So let's say, I guess the request comes in from a client, it goes to the server. Can it be sent out to a different client or a different server?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a good question. So in today's example, we have built a pretty simple integration that just simply prints a label out. You can create as many actions as you need here. So if you look on the actions list and you hit the little blue icon, which is add, you can do an output, and you can send. And it doesn't necessarily have to be via a web request. It can, though. it's the first option at the top, a response to a different client or the same client in a different form or through a different socket, whatever, or port, whatever it may be. So really that's all customizable, and you can most definitely do that. So just look at the options under actions and then output.
If any of the parameters passed through the get URL are wrong, does it return a proper message, EX? Does it say printer name is invalid or label file name is invalid?
Yeah, so when you're just in the testing the integration phase, so that's when that would come up. Any error messages that you have will come up here under output, and it will reference that. So if you have a mismatch and maybe you have a typo, you're passing the wrong variable for, just on accident, or you forgot to account for something, this is where you would look into, test the integration, make sure it's printing successfully. And if you do see any of the red, which is the X, the errors, that's when you would know that you did something wrong. You would read the error message and it would refer to the bad typo in the URL or in the actions, wherever it may be.
Yeah, and if the question is kind of referencing the actual response that gets sent back out, you can get an error message back to the client issuing the print request as well. The serial number option, how does the override work? Do you just send the starting number?
Yeah, so there's two parts to the serial number. Okay, so, and actually for the serial number and talking about variables, this answer applies to really any integration method. But checking this box, and for example, saying 10 serial numbers, does not mean that it's going to start at 10. What this means is you want 10 serial numbers counting up on whatever behavior you set up in your label itself. If you want to actually give a starting number to a named data source, which would be the serial number, you would use the named data sources down here. So let's say you want it to start at 1, you would have your serial number start at 1, and you would want it to print 10 of those serial numbers for you. And as long as you have your label set up to count up, that way it'll count up to 10 for you. Now remember also, that is an option as well, but if your application or system can't send the starting number or can't reset the serial number every time, there is an option in the label itself to reset the serial number to custom sequences if it's not just your standard 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. In general, whenever you're looking for any kind of resource, so like for example, these recordings, you're stuck, something's not working or broken, or you just want to learn something new about the software or you're curious, this is a good place to start. The URL is support.seaglescientific.com, and we're always adding new articles. And if you see here, that's one of the ways that you would have been made aware of the upcoming webinars, one of them being the one we're on now. Once again, as always, thank you everyone so much for joining. I hope you learned a little bit about building a web integration today. I hope you have a good rest of your day.